And there we go. Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to conversation number 43 with the TLC. Today, we're going to be talking about building statistical intuition and skills for analysts and marketers with our host of the day, Tim Wilson, and panelists, thank you, Elea Feit, Matt Policastro, and Lizzie Eardley. Oh, cool new picture, Tim. Tim works with me at Search Discovery. He's a senior analytics director and the co-host of the Digital Analytics Power Hour. As such, he is in some ways a celebrity, a big celebrity in the industry. What did you tell me about the podcast? Did you say that it was like the only analytics
explicit
podcast?
Analytics podcast? It's all about qualifying. It's
right,
all about the adjectives.
It's all about the adjectives. He's on a campaign to level up his own and hopefully convince others of the importance of leveling up their statistical intuition. And he's created a whole bunch of content to get there and has shared that all. And we'll get to share, he's going to share some of that with all of us today. And then we also have a link to the video, a video version of the slides he's going to share today, which I'll share with everybody afterwards. Also invited Lizzie, Ellie, and Matt to join Tim to have a discussion or debate, however it ends up, to learn a little bit more about what statistical intuition is, why it matters, who needs it, and maybe how we can better build it. Lizzie is at Split. She's a data scientist and former astrophysicist, which is really cool. Every time I go back and read that, Lizzie, I think, wow, what a path and how lucky we are to have you here. So thank you for joining us. My favorite thing about Lizzie is that she really does a great job of breaking down complex concepts in statistics in a way that, you know, the rest of us can understand that aren't astrophysicists. Same for Dr. Elea Feit of Drexel University. She has been a frequent TLC member, and she does a fantastic job of helping others understand really complex statistical concepts. She does great storytelling. She's given me great examples that I've been able to use in different training sessions that I've built that have been super, super helpful. She teaches data-driven digital marketing and marketing experiments at Drexel, and she loves making technical material approachable and accessible, which I say she does very well. And also former TLC host or panelist, speaker, whatever we want to say. Anyway, super smart guy, currently at Surefoot and digital analytics manager. He creates hats frequently, but right now he is working at Surefoot doing the analytics management. He has also, I don't know, you've been the optimization lead, you've been the statistician or the data scientist, and now working in analytics. So he does everything, but he's got his MS in business analytics. And nothing makes him more suspicious than a winning test, which I think we can all completely understand and agree. And if you don't, you will after this call. So with that, Tim, I'll pass it to you.
All right. So for anybody who thinks that it looks my headshot looks like me combined with Starry Night, that is like a product of deepdreamgenerator.com, which my son turned me on to like a week ago, and I'm now fascinated with it because anything I can do to make myself look less realistic is generally a plus if my face is going to be on screen. So this is the topic, and the way that we decided we're going to set it up is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, is try to kind of set the stage, make a case for what this topic is. If you were paying careful attention, I'm the least educated on the front of this topic when it comes to everyone on our panel. So hopefully I'm coming at it from I am a person who is trying to figure out how to get to some of the points of knowledge that the Lizzies and Ellies and Matt have and are having to teach themselves. So what we're gonna do is one way to think about this, and poor Zoom management. I can't see my own slides. Hold on. Okay, am I still sharing?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay. So I've been in consulting long enough that apparently everything needs to be a 2x2 matrix for me, or I see the world that way. But one way I've started thinking about this is that there are two different groups. There's kind of analysts, which is that's a broad bucket. I would say almost everyone on this call, we can kind of consider ourselves analysts. And then there are sort of the stakeholders, the marketers, the business users. That's kind of one dimension. And then we said statistical intuition and statistical skills. And the intuition is admittedly kind of a squishy concept. It may not be the right label, but I think it's actually, because it's squishy, it's actually really, really powerful and important. It's just kind of hard to kind of wrap our hands around it. And that's kind of one of the things I'm hoping we get to talk about today. So if we think about the world in kind of that 2x2, or this topic in sort of a 2x2 matrix, the question is kind of where should we be in kind of an ideal state? What's kind of the level of each one of these intersections we want the world to have? And I will propose that we want our analysts to have a high degree of statistical intuition and a high level of statistical skills in an ideal world. I think stakeholders actually would benefit if they had at least a moderate level of this thing called statistical intuition, because it will help them actually think about the problems they're trying to solve. It will help them work with the analysts. It will help them not overinterpret or misinterpret or have unrealistic expectations for what they're getting with the data. And it wouldn't hurt for them to have, a little bit of statistical skills here and there, but whether it's low or none, I don't really know. The thing is, if you develop a lot of statistical skills, I think intuition can kind of come along. I think another topic for debate. What I feel like where we kind of are painting with a very, very broad brush as an industry is that marketers tend to have like no statistical intuition or very, very little. And again, broad brush, definitely there are plenty of exceptions out there, I'm sure. And part of the reason is that I think a lot of analysts haven't really gotten the intuition around the data. And I am coming from kind of a digital analytics background, less of other types of analysis, less of a kind of an optimization or testing background. And then on the statistical skills, I think even in spaces like testing, I think it tends to be kind of narrow groups. I think a lot of testing analysts who are involved with testing may be pretty comfortable with p-values and confidence intervals and confidence levels and power and confidence, but there's a whole lot more to this world of statistics than just kind of how we're going to look at testing. When, the whole hand wringing around sample ratio mismatch, that's chi-squared test, a pretty basic statistical test, but it kind of was something like, oh, wow, that's cool. We can do this chi-square with cross tab. I just butchered it, what it's called. So that's kind of the framing. So what I heard from some analysts when I started saying, I think we need to develop more of the statistical intuition, is I would get pushback that you're crazy. This is a bad idea. You want marketers to learn statistics. That'll never happen. You shouldn't be expecting it to happen. That's not their job. That's our job as analysts. And that's not at all what I'm saying. I think the people who have that reaction, who listen to me say, I think we need to develop this intuition, and that is their reaction, are often the analysts who don't really have the skills and the intuition that they probably should have. So I kind of trigger them when I start saying we need to kind of up-level our knowledge of statistics. It's kind of scary, I think, to many analysts. And being someone who's been in digital analytics for right at 2 decades now, I didn't quite realize what I was missing until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I still haven't completely figured out everything that I was missing. So I'm hoping we can kind of tackle kind of 3 broad questions today. One, is this topic at all important? From a selection bias, hopefully everyone who's here thinks this topic does kind of matter, but how do we actually frame that it matters to the broader industry? I sort of set it up as saying there are kind of multiple dimensions to this. So are there specific areas that are bigger needs? Is it the statistical intuition of an analyst? Is that really where we need to focus? Is it statistical skills for marketers? Is that really where we need to focus? So I think if we can have a little bit of a discussion around that, that would be great. If we can hone in on that, then there's kind of the really big question is, how do we actually do it? How do we actually help teach and kind of move sort of the knowledge of the people who need to have more knowledge? How do we actually help them move up that path? Because statistics can be hard. So I'm going to try to make the case for kind of why I think this is so important. And I'm going to do it by way of 3 examples. And they're just kind of 3 semi-random, well, not randomly picked. They're just 3 examples. They are 3 representative examples, I hope, of explaining why I think this is such an important topic overall. The first example is going to be super familiar. It's really important, but it's kind of the least interesting to this crowd. And that is just straight up A/B testing. And I'm pretty sure if we did a poll, 95% of the people on this call would say they have dealt with this, where they explain the concept of A/B testing to their stakeholders. The stakeholder says, great, I get it. That's so cool. Let's run ourselves some A/B tests. present the results of the test, and then the marketer says, aha, I understand what's going on here. I've got B, I've got A. I now know with absolute certainty that if I ran B from now all the way into the future for all eternity, I would have a 7.6% higher conversion rate than if I ran A from now all the way through eternity. Obviously, we all look at that and say that is a oversimplification and is actually wrong. How would a statistician or a CRO or a, somebody who's more knowledgeable would say, that's not, you're kind of overinterpreting it. Really, we're just saying that we observed a higher conversion rate, and the difference in that observed conversion rate was high enough that we can say that experience B is performs better than experience A, and it's at a statistically significant at a 95% confidence level, which all of a sudden becomes a mouthful. The marketer looks at the analyst and says, why you got to use those big fancy words? Isn't that exactly what I said? And of course it's not. The correct interpretation is going to prevent things like just doing multiplying out and coming up with a, annualized revenue is a specific number, because it's inherently, it recognizes sort of the uncertainty that's within the data. Sometimes we actually say, let's maybe add confidence intervals so we can at least kind of show in our visual that there's a little bit of, there's uncertainty within what we observed. We just observed when we ran the test, we observed the results. So that's one example. Hopefully that one's super, super familiar. Now we're going to try to hit a couple examples that maybe will push your thinking a little bit more. So we're going to move out of the world of A/B testing and look at just historical data. And this is a real example that happened at Search Discovery, lightly obfuscated to, protect the guilty. But the actual numbers, the actual data in this is very, very real. And what had happened was, this was for reasons we won't go into, a B2B company had drastically ramped up the calls, the sales calls that their sales reps were making to their prospects. And at the same time as the volume of those in-person sales calls were ramping up, they were noticing that the traffic to the website was declining. And so the marketer looked at that and said, I'm pretty sure I know what's going on here. Our sales team is getting out in front of our prospects. And because they're getting out in front of our prospects, they're delivering the information that we would normally deliver through the website. That means there's no need for the prospects to come to the website. And so the increase in sales calls is causing the decrease in website visits. Hey, analyst, can you go and confirm that? And the analyst was, very much on top of said, let's not jump to causation. Let's just start with correlation. And before we try to get to any sort of causality, let's even see if we've got correlation here. I agree, one's going up, one's going down. Looks like a pretty clear case of inverse correlation, but we can do a better visualization. Let's take that same data and just put it on a scatter plot. And I don't even need to calculate a correlation coefficient. Like, this is clearly a strong inverse correlation, but I'll go ahead and I'll get my R squared. And sure enough, okay, absolutely, there's a strong correlation between these two metrics. And I don't know how many on this call right now are realizing how wrong that is of a way of a leap to make. That's unfortunate because what was missed here, it's in the title. This data is non-stationary. In fancy terms, it's saying that if we look at the means at different points, the means are different. But we can think of non-stationarity here as just being the data is trending. So is it possible that really time is what's going on here? And one of these metrics is trending up with time, and one of them is generally trending down with time, but they're not actually related to each other. Is there a way to even check that? Is there a way to say it's not just time? Are they actually trending with each other? And there's a very simple technique that can take non-stationary data and make it much more stationary. I'm not sure it makes it fully stationary, but it makes it more stationary. If these are truly inversely correlated, then when we move from one week to the next, if website visits dropped a lot, if they were perfectly inversely correlated, then I would expect sales calls to change from week to week. It would expect it to go up a lot. And this is just one example where it didn't. This is called first difference. Very simple. You can do second difference and third difference. Pretty simple idea. Wrap your head around the concept. You're like, oh, that's pretty cool. We're looking if they changed in the same direction. And if instead we take the first difference, which is now a more stationary data set, then instead of having our plotting the absolute values, if we plot the first differences, all of a sudden the story completely changes. we calculate our R squared, it's like 0.04. And we can say, you know what, if we control for time, then these actually aren't related. They both were generally trending up or down, but not really with each other. So we could go back to the marketer and say, now it's a more complicated story. If they say, I'm looking at the chart, they're trending. It's like, yeah, but we've controlled for time. If I could get that marketer to have some intuition around what controlling for X means, then I've got a much, much better discussion with them. And we're not trying to look for causality that's just not there. So that's my second example. This one kind of blew my mind. And I will freely admit that about 7 years ago, that chart on the left, I totally did that with the data set and had no idea. None of the marketers knew what I did was terrible. I didn't know it was terrible. It didn't cause the company to go under, but I feel bad about it. So I kind of wonder, how often are other analysts doing something like that? Because they don't know about stationarity and ways to actually work with stationarity. Or as I've researched statistics and realized that time series data, which is like the core of what so much of us in digital work with, most programs in data science or statistics, that's not the first semester. There'll be a whole course dedicated just to dealing with time series data. And it's not the introductory level course. So that's kind of a challenge for us as well. How do we deal with time series data in a responsible way without going back to multiple years of schooling? So third example, and this is kind of the big topic, and Ellie and I had kind of a fun back and forth as we were kind of prepping for this, is do we want to try to explain causal inference? And we both agreed causal inference is a big, big deal. It's just, is it too theoretical and academic? So I'm going to make a case that if we could help marketers and analysts kind of understand the ideas behind causal inference, there's a whole lot of upside for the value that we can help deliver to our organizations. So let's take and just break down what we're talking about here. Let's imagine we have one visitor comes to our website and we make them, let's just say, a 10% off offer. The language of statistics, that's the treatment that we gave them. It's an intervention. And we observe that one visitor, and we observe that visitor purchases, and they purchase for $100. Great. So what did we not observe? Because we chose to treat that visitor with a 10% off offer, what we didn't do was not treat them, not have an intervention. And we don't know what they would have done. But what they would have done if we had not treated them, that is our potential outcome or our counterfactual. And counterfactual's potential outcomes, that is the language of causal inference. So how can we actually say what value the 10% off offer delivered? Everyone on this call says, I know the answer. We run a test. We don't have just one visitor. We have 10,000 visitors, and 5,000 of them we treat with a 10% off offer. 5,000 of them we don't treat with a 10% off offer. We compare the outcomes. We're back to kind of that first example. As long as we interpret the results as having some inherent variability in them, it's great. So randomization, we do an experiment. Quoting Ellie again, 1, 2, 3, repeat after me. Randomization is the key. I think I got that right. We'll find out. So that's why we love to do A/B tests. But here's the question. Let's think about, what if we didn't run the offer as a test? What if we had 10,000 visitors come to our site and we made all of them a 10% off offer? Does that mean that there is no counterfactual? No, the counterfactual still exists. Whether or not we choose to do an experiment or not, the counterfactuals are still there. And that is a really powerful and profound concept. And we know that in life, in business, there are tons of things we can't test, either for practical reasons, for capacity reasons. We don't test everything. That's just not feasible. So what if we actually acknowledge counterfactuals in the world where we're not doing some testing? Let's think about how when we run a campaign, a multi-channel campaign, lots of channels running for some period of time, and how do we typically measure the impact of a campaign? There's just too many. Maybe there's some tests running within the campaign on some emails, maybe on some landing pages, but overall for the campaign, we're not running the whole campaign as a test. It's just too broad and too big. And that campaign, we're expecting to deliver some results. And we want to actually measure the impact of the campaign. How do we typically do that? Well, a lot of times, and again, painting with a broad brush, the analyst would say, well, let me take through my UTM parameters, my campaign tracking, my conversion pixels. Let me find every possible person who purchased that I can see had some interaction with the campaign. let me add up the total value of their orders, and I'm going to say that's the value that the campaign delivered. And we know that's problematic, and it's problematic for two big reasons. One gets a lot of hand wringing and teeth gnashing in the industry right now, which is third-party cookies are going away, privacy regulations are stopping our tracking, walled gardens, Facebook, Apple's doing things. We're losing visibility. What about the video that was viewed on Facebook, and then the person came and purchased with their desktop? I can't observe that link. Oh my goodness, I'm missing out on revenue. I'm undercounting the value of the campaign. Lots of hand wringing on that front. True, all fair points. But what about customers who would have purchased anyway? If we turned off the campaign, would revenue have been, if we had not run the campaign, would revenue have been zero? Unlikely. This is, as Joe Sutherland, the SDI's head of data science, I love this example. And it's kind of how we get to some overcounting. It's, imagine that you're at the grocery store and you stand behind the checkout counters and you kind of walk back and forth until you see somebody walking up with a 12-pack of Pepsi about to check out. And you run up to that person while they're standing in line and say, you should buy Pepsi. And then you run away. And then you kind of linger in the background and watch. And you know what? The person, they bought a 12-pack of Pepsi. So you say, aha, I treated them with my telling them, I marketed to them that they should buy Pepsi, and they bought Pepsi. Therefore, I should get credit, which we know they would have purchased Pepsi anyway. And if we think about how we're trying to do better targeting of our media, if we're not really careful, if we said, what's the perfect type of media targeting, you are going to be targeting and marketing to people who would have bought your products or services anyway. So we look at these and say, well, there's undercounting and overcounting. Can we just assume that they kind of come out in the wash and keep using the technique that we're using? I hope not, because the undercounting and the overcounting are completely unrelated to each other. So let's think about it a different way. What if instead of that sort of tracking and linking, we said, let's run the campaign. Let's just look at the total revenue we got while the campaign was running and for some period after for the product or the product line or the service that we were selling. And let's just measure the total and say that was our observed total revenue. Now let's go into counterfactual land and let's just envision a different parallel universe where we didn't run the campaign. And let's just estimate what revenue we would have gotten if we had not run the campaign. That's our counterfactual. That's our potential outcome. If we have that estimated potential revenue number, then our calculation of the campaign impact is way, way better. And it's pretty simple. We just take the total revenue that we observed, we subtract the revenue we would have observed without the campaign. That's our effect of the campaign. And that's the calculation. Now, the reaction that we'll get is, well, that's great. You just envisioned a parallel universe that you can't estimate that. There's no possible way of estimating that. You don't have that second number. That's where we're stuck. All hope is lost. And that's just not true. It just requires, ta-da, some advanced statistics. There are techniques, diff and diff, two-stage least squares, regression discontinuity. There are techniques for estimating that potential revenue. Again, with some variability and uncertainty, but we can do that. We just have to recognize that we should try. We should make the effort. It's the exact same world when it comes to the way that multi-touch attribution is typically done. The marketer kind of comes at it saying, how do I take the total revenue we got and kind of spread it out across the different buckets that I touched? And that ignores the counterfactual of, hey, some of these channels, some of these people would have purchased anyway, even if we had not intervened, even if we had not had the channel or the tactic. And that's why a statistician or a data scientist says, it's not how do we divvy up credit across all the touch points, it's what's the mean effect on revenue for each channel. So it's kind of a cousin to the broader campaign approach. So kind of my last main slide here, I would claim that if we actually got more analysts and more marketers kind of just intuiting this idea of causal inference and counterfactuals and recognizing there are things that could be done with it, two things would happen. One, there'd actually be more demand for experimentation because there'd be a recognition that that's kind of the gold standard. A randomized controlled trial is the best way to actually get to causality of any sort of intervention or treatment or campaign or tactic that we put out there. But I think there would also be more demand for kind of application of sort of what we broadly call causal inference methods, techniques. That means analysts are going to have to increase what they can do. There may need to be some shifts in hiring. There may need to be some collaboration with consultants or with academia to actually pull that off. It is not necessarily easy, but it's actually much, much more valid and useful to actually be measuring these things more effectively. And I kind of wonder, when we start talking about looking at observational data and trying to do causal inference, that's often called quasi experiments. So arguably, this group, the world of test and learn, could actually be involved and engaged with quasi experiments that aren't the kind of traditional experimentation that we've done. So it's an opportunity kind of for us to sort of move into that world as well and really help out doing things in a fundamentally different way. So back to kind of the three questions. That was my three examples trying to make the case. I'm hoping that some of you kind of thought at least one of those examples was kind of cool and maybe made you think a little bit different. But so back to the three questions, we're going to try to have a discussion about, is this a big deal? Who is it the most big of a deal for? And what could we actually do to actually move the needle? So I'm going to keep sharing, which means I'm going to be looking over at Slack and at my other screen. And maybe I'll put this up as kind of an initial framing. And now I'm going to kind of ask my fellow panelists if they have any immediate reactions, if they think I'm full of it on any particular area, or if there's anything that particularly resonated with them. Who just feels like they want to chime in? And I'm counting on one of you to do that.
I can say my immediate reaction was, it makes me feel very lucky that these days I mostly focus on A/B testing, because it's so much simpler. Like, people think that A/B testing is difficult, but then when I see this talk, I realize that actually this is the simplest of all the possible options. So yeah, so I think it's good to remember that things could be a lot harder, and we should be grateful for kind of the simplicity of being able to A/B test. And it's really great talk, thank you. And of the examples, I think the non-stationary one was the most interesting one for me, because when I first saw it, I have to admit, I was kind of, what's wrong here? You know, I didn't really initially get the point you made, but after you explained it, totally makes sense. So thanks.
I feel like we should not brand this out to marketers as the astrophysicist said this stuff is hard. Like, that's probably not going to help us sell it to the.
Yeah, I'll jump in and kind of blame the academy that I guess I'm representing on this panel, that I think we do. This resonates a lot with me, this 2x2, because we do a really bad job in undergraduate education of explaining what statistics really is. A lot of work is spent teaching you the mechanics of inference, which is really the last stage in a good analysis. And we don't have people walking out of their Stat 101 class understanding, okay, if I'm going to do some quantitative analysis, the first thing I need to think about is, what's the decision I'm trying to make? In your example, their third example there, Tim, that decision is, I am trying to decide whether or not to buy ads. Simple. Then I think next, well, what is the counterfactual I need to estimate in order to figure that out? Oh, I need to know how much I would sell with the ads and without the ads, because then I can simply subtract those, and then that tells me how much the ads are worth. Oh, cool. That's cool. All right. And then the third step is, once I have some estimates of those, how certain am I about it? And we put all the emphasis in Stat 101 on that how certain am I question, without backing up and saying, what's the decision I'm trying to make? And what is the counterfactual I need to estimate in order to make that decision? And so I think, because I'd rather my students walk out of the room knowing that 1, 2, and 3 are important than knowing how to do 3, because they can figure out from Wikipedia how to do 3 later. They have to know that 1, 2, and 3 are important. And I think anyone in your 2x2, any of these people can learn that those things are important, 1, 2, 3.
Which I feel like that means they walk out and they sort of teach. We've conditioned the marketers to think that number 3 in your example, if done really, really well, eliminates uncertainty and gives us absolute answers. And it doesn't necessarily give us the right question, a good question, and doesn't give us comfort even uncertainty. I remember
it's a veil of officialness on things that could be completely misguided.
It's got a bunch of significant digits, so it must be right. But even the uncertainty in the thinking through, I remember Kelly and I a couple of years ago, I certainly had like the epiphany that being uncertainty in goes in two directions. You know, there's type 1 and type 2. And boy, you start talking type 1, type 2, the marketers, their eyes glaze over, but you're like, what's the cost? I remember Matt Gershoff showing a confusion matrix, and I'm like, oh, so maybe I don't care if I'm horribly inaccurate about this aspect of being wrong, but I really care about this aspect of being wrong. And then if the marketer could say, how do I really over-index to the part I really care about and not care about the other part?
Yeah, if I can jump in here. So I've been like laser focused on that hyphen there for the stakeholders in terms of their statistical intuition, because I think, to like Ellie's point, a lot of this is coming down to decision making. Like, what are you actually doing for your organization or your business, and is that actually prudent? And a lot of times, we're for a lot of folks who are engaged in statistics or analysis and trying to do things with experimentation, oftentimes it is a sort of like accountability laundering of, hey, we ran an experiment. Like whatever happened as a result of that, it's unassailable. We ran the experiment. When a lot of times people are running underpowered experiments where they haven't gathered enough data, or they're not asking the right questions, or not even coming in with a question. And that's the stuff where I think that if you can have the most impact, it's going back to folks and trying to reframe it in that confusion matrix of, no, this is what it actually means for the business. Like, here's the risk in return for these different outcomes, and how do we put that back together? And even having the space to admit, like, hey, sometimes experimentation is not the right approach. Like, I just had a test come through where someone was like, yeah, we ran this for 2 weeks and we thought it was a really solid result. And I'm like, you have 200 people in this test that was running on your site. Like, this is not helpful for us making a determination. What we should just pivot to doing something like user testing, or just doing some direct feedback. And you can get a lot more value from that, as opposed to just saying, well, I went on Stat Overflow and it told me to run this test and it gave me a significant result, so therefore I'm right and we have to go do this.
And Matt, you're interesting in that in some ways you and I have a similar background, except you went and kind of fixed things by going back to school and getting a master's degree. And I've just been stumbling along on Stack Overflow. If you reflect on where you were when you said, I need to go and learn more about this business analytics, because your background, I'm sure I'll butcher it a little bit, but you were doing kind of digital analytics and paid search type stuff, right? Like you were in the boat of kind of a traditional analyst. Did you come out of that, and maybe even since then, because that's been a number of years, fundamentally realizing you were learning something very different from what you thought you were going to learn when you went in?
I mean, personally, I think so. Like, I don't want to over-index on my experiences. Just, I'm some guy on the internet, but I think for a lot of it, it does come back to this more strategic approach of, as people who are practicing quantitative sciences or quantitative practices inside of their organizations, we have a responsibility to the people around us. Like, I think if we were going to go to some utopian vision of the future, it would be everyone in the organization, product managers, the executive suite, everybody, they would have a solid grounding in statistics, like, and not just the fundamentals of, I know how to calculate significance for a test, but that 1, 2, 3 approach that Ellie was laying out of, from start to finish, this is the right way for us to try to determine whether we're making the right decision or not. And yeah, for me, it was a pretty significant game changer, because I was just, some putts going along doing visualizations like, look, I can do a 3D graphic for, where traffic is coming in around the country, but that's not actually helping anybody. That's just, it's giving the impression that I'm very certain about something, which I might feel in that moment, but it's not actually quantifying all the risks that are inherent with that. And I think just, to your point, like for the consulting work and for the other sort of more standard agency stuff I've been doing, a lot of times it just comes back to, analysts are treated as this separate group of folks who are there to either give a rubber stamp of approval, or to or you're even just the entry level like analyst, and someone says, is this the right decision or not? And you're like, sure, I don't know. And what people are really I think what a lot of organizations come back, they're looking for a yes or a no, when in reality, I think a lot of statistics, and forgive me, I saw this online somewhere and I've been trying to find the source for it for the last week, but statistics is not about coming up with a yes or no answer. It's coming up with the most defensible interpretation of reality. And it is about trying to find something that is going to be the least BS, as opposed to just a, hey, this is the quick decision, yes or no. And we can do some of that work of getting to, we can remove some of the complexity. Like, people do not need to know about type 1 and type 2 error. That's the stuff that we can swallow and we can keep in the appendix of our deck. That stuff doesn't matter. But coming back to, hey, we think this, it depends, here are the things to take into consideration. But I know I'm going on a bit.
So maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes just specifically and Matt, you said coming back to the hyphen, it'd be great to hear from everyone where they because we all have different sort of perspectives on who we're interacting with. Is this, where would we say, is this an accurate representation? If we accept the grid as the construct, would we paint with, granted we're a sample of 4 people with the people that we've interacted with, that these labels are low and medium and they should be moved, I guess? Or anybody think they're too generous or not generous enough? We're spot on. We can move to another topic.
I think this is about right, but let me put some fear in everybody. And maybe this is the fear that you can put in the junior analysts working for you who have a marketing background, who say, this is good enough. So by happenstance, my class is on data-driven digital marketing, is co-listed into a business analytics program as an elective you can take in a business analytics undergrad. But most of the business analytics students major in finance and business analytics. Well, for random reasons, there were very few electives offered in the fall. And so I got a whole bunch of those finance and business analytics majors in the class, and they loved it. They're coming for you. They're young, they're smart, they can handle the numbers, they have statistical skills, they're learning statistical intuition. And as soon as they get the lay of the land in marketing, they're gonna be the analysts that join that are high on your grid. And that's gonna change things a lot. As more quantitative young people realize that marketing can be really quantitative, they're like, oh, this is cool. I thought if I wanted to do numbers, I should do finance or accounting, but oh, I can do marketing. That's exciting for them. And so as soon as I get them trained, they're going to be out there and kicking everyone's butts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does play to a funny dynamic in the space, which is that I think once you're embedded in an organization, like once you kind of have your, hey, here are my KPIs for the next year, you're going to be encouraged to embrace this sort of dogmatism of, hey, this is the stuff that we know how to do, and opening yourself up to new approaches is risky. And it is if you're working for a marketing department and if you're trying to determine whether or not your ad spend is valuable, like, you're going to want to choose the mode of analysis or the mode of interpretation that's probably going to be more flattering to your advertisements than not. Like, no one wants to say, hey, by the way, I just ran the numbers. 50% of our budget last year was basically flushed down the toilet. And no one's expecting to get a gold star from their boss for saying that. And unless you're someone new coming in and you're like, hey, I need to leave my imprint and I need to make an impression on my boss, and this is my first year, I want to do something really impressive. But I think it's just, you have to make the space, and that's why personally I think it is really important for the leadership to say, hey, mistakes happen, like error is a part of business. And that's why we have to build in these sort of outlets or these gaps for sometimes stuff happens and we just have to we have to reevaluate our decisions based on the data in front of us and not just do whatever a statistical test has told us. Again, it's just this sort of contextual waiting for, there's a lot of uncertainty around these things. And yeah, because I mean, when I taught undergrads as well, like, I had some folks who love that stuff. And then I have gone back and checked in with them. And they're like, yeah, I'm just kind of running t-tests and just doing some linear regressions. And that's like kind of the end of it.
So I'm trying to scan the questions to see if
you got a question for Matt from Matt, sorry. Question for the panel. What is the incentive for marketers, or really anyone who already have a ton of stuff to do to get their work out the door, to invest in this, especially if the rest of the org doesn't appreciate its time?
Isn't it the incentive supposed to be they want to do their job well? I mean, I don't know. Were you about to say something, Lizzie?
I think part of the problem is there is this lack of incentive. So if you present data that makes your work look good, then that's good for you. So it is difficult to have that incentive of actually making sure putting the time in to get the right answer, especially if it doesn't make you look good. So maybe there isn't one right now, but that's part of the problem.
I feel like if you use bad data to look good, or you don't apply the appropriate statistical intuition to your interpretation of results, it makes you look good in the short term, potentially. It makes you look real bad in the long term.
Except the Freakonomics post that the two-part episode series that Freakonomics did that were basically, oh my God, the Unilever. I mean, the fact that if you can use data poorly and then use horrible logic. And if you're happen to be in a business in an economy that's doing well and nobody's there to call you on it. I mean, I think that was, I mean, in those episodes where and I know his name, I'm just trying to show self-restraint and not rattling off because he peeved me so much. But he said, well, of course advertising works. Look at Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble, and they've been around for 100 years, and they've been doing advertising, ergo advertising works. And it's like, what that is such flawed logic and rationale, and that's the best you can come up with. And Stephen Dubner is trying to get you to acknowledge that. So I think the question is, when does the long term happen? I'm with you that like they have to believe that if they have to be aware that they're probably doing it wrong, and it will probably bite them at some point, but can they ride their careers out before it bites them in the butt? Or is this something that's imminent and they really better correct the way they do it?
You make a good point.
So
since you brought up that Freakonomics podcast, I have an axe to grind on it. Is that okay? Can I have
please.
2 minutes to grind my axe?
You know that's Tim's favorite, right?
That episode made it. So I'm sure we'll put a link in the Slack. It took a strong stance that advertising doesn't work. And that's actually not what the research says. So one of the researchers featured on that episode was Anna Tuckman, who's at Northwestern and working with a couple of marketing faculty at Chicago. They actually used RDD to come back to something you mentioned in your talk, this regression discontinuity idea, to measure the effectiveness of TV ads. And what they actually do is they compare people who live just inside and just outside of a particular DMA. So some people see the ads and some people don't, but they should be very similar. That's the counterfactual, is that the people on the other side of the border of the DMA should be very similar. And that gives them an estimate of how the ads work. But the estimates don't say that ads don't work. They say that lots of ads don't work and some ads do. And the sort of takeaway for the analyst is, I could figure out which are the ads that work. And you could reallocate the budgets and do a lot better on your marketing ROI. I mean, organizational, issues are real, and I understand that, but the methods are developing to a point where we actually can answer the question, which ads work, and that's gonna transform marketing once everybody is on board with actually measuring that and knowing which ads work.
But isn't it a lot easier to, if you get a director of marketing or a CMO who in the back of their mind thinks, I'd rather have somebody who thinks advertising doesn't work, which maybe it means we need somebody from the sales organization because they always think marketing doesn't work. If they start with the default of it doesn't work, and then they're asking me to provide evidence that it does, then it feels like we're moving down a path of saying, let's design the way we're going to get to that. When there's the presumption that it does, where we're needing to tell them that it doesn't. I mean, I was about to throw out use null hypothesis probably poorly, but the null hypothesis is there's no effective advertising. And then you're looking to say, when can I disprove that null hypothesis? Whereas it gets treated as the assumption is we do all of this, it must work. Because I agree, it certainly, if you have no recognition, if nobody's ever heard of you, then advertising is going to do more for you than if everybody's heard of you. But I will point back to marketing wants to make everything super, super simple. When paid search first emerged, it was amazing. People searching for this thing, and you can put your ad in front of them and it worked. And so now it's like paid search works for everything. It's like, well, no, like if I'm looking for some advanced cancer drug, am I out like saying, hey, Google, what drug should I use for this, late stage cancer? Somewhat, maybe not, but that's certainly different from I'm looking for, a pair of tennis shoes. But we want to have, again, the marketer is drawn to wanting to have like the simple answer. Sorry, I see your rant and match you with a less coherent one.
Just set the analyst out to find the ads that work. Some work, some don't.
Well, and not to just to another one of in the exchange for this, Ellie, so you said the regression discontinuity. You also had the study that you did way back in Europe, and I'm blanking on where it was. That was a diff and diff. They used diff and diff to look at whether providing more contextual. It was again to me very. I don't know if you could give that as
sure. So I have a paper with folks in Vienna, Wirtschaftsuniversität. So I love it that there's a business school that's actually called like University of Work. So I like saying their name a lot. What we did was we looked at an ad exchange using diff and diff, which is another one of these causal inference methods. We looked at whether or not when an ad exchange makes more context information available about display ads. So specifically, what is the subdomain where the ad will appear? So they went from having no information to having the subdomain information. And we used diff and diff to show that increased the prices from about 90 euro cents to $1, which is a huge lift in prices. And that has lots of implications for, how we do context transparency in other markets. So not as, it's sort of like an edge case kind of thing to look at, but a nice example of, thinking through carefully what was the decision. Well, we have to decide whether we should try to make context information more transparent in ad markets. What was the thing you really need to know? Well, I really need to know, in a world where they hadn't made that information available, what would the prices of the ads be selling at? And that's hard to actually figure out because this all happened in the spring, and ad prices increase in the spring in general because there's less internet traffic in Europe as people go on vacation. And so there's fewer ad impressions available and the prices go up. And so we were figuring out what was the counterfactual amount by which prices would have gone up. And so that we could compare that to the actual amount by which prices went up. And we can say they went up, that difference, that counterfactual difference was about 10 euro cents.
I love that. It's like, it's a publisher example, not the advertiser or the marketer, but it's like, yeah, these are like real things that can be done. They can be hard, but they're actually answering a real question. So,
hey, I want to interrupt. We've got about 7 minutes left, and over in the TLC calls chat, we've kind of come to several people asking similar versions of the question. How do we teach it? Who needs the education most? Matt says, if we're talking about this and we think it's important, which I think we've all come to that agreement, at least somewhat, then what's the program method advocacy approach to affect the change?
So I'm going to, let me do a quick, he didn't see that because it doesn't fully answer the question, but this is like a framework I came up with a few months ago that it's just an excuse to have it on the slide because it may help with the discussion, because I realized that I think this causal inference, I think, is a really big deal. I think decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and or understanding variability, I kind of cheekily label those enlightened nirvana. That's to me heavy on the intuition front. And then I think we've got the hard skills like Ellie's step 3, of which there are hundreds of them. And then I've sort of started thinking about it that in between there are these concepts, which just learning a concept of population versus sample. Another minor rant, I think we did ourselves a disservice because the promise of digital was we don't need statistics, because if statistics is about predicting the population from a sample, we have all the data. And that was kind of a poor framing, but we've now been dealing with it for 20 years. But the concepts and the skills kind of get related to each other. And ultimately we're trying to get to the intuition. The one thing I have the most hope for is like building up these examples. Like I feel like I'm so gratified by Lizzie saying that my non-stationarity example was like compelling. I feel like marketers might actually kind of like some of like examples. The more it can be tied to the data they've seen, that can kind of hook into, here's an idea of stationarity, which means now you're armed to just know you shouldn't be looking at things at face value, even if they don't have to learn first difference, or even if they're doing, other techniques. So
Tim, when I looked at this slide when you first shared it, my initial thought was I want my leaders and stakeholders to have that orange and blue level. They don't have to understand the applied methods, but I want my analysts to have all of it. But Merritt asks a really interesting question, which is that, should all analysts be required to have some kind of formal training on statistics, beyond the 101 and 201 level, so that they can apply all of those different techniques or understand them well enough that they can actually develop the nirvana intuition.
Depends on whether they want Ellie's students to take their jobs or not.
Right.
I don't know. I think this scares the analyst, right? I mean, that's the thing is, I think analysts, just like analysts will shy away from learning Python or SQL or R because it's scary and there's a big learning curve, and there's a big learning curve on this as well. So should versus, I think it goes back to who would even be receptive to it. But
I have to say, at least my experience in college was that we did these things. We did linear regressions, we did ANOVAs, we did diff and dis and cluster analysis. And then I went into the real world and we didn't use those techniques. So I don't know that analysts in general would be afraid so much as I feel like there needs to be an expectation that we are using these things that we've learned and we are applying them. Or maybe, like Ellie, you use so many wonderful examples in the past of how you teach your students in a practical way, how not just to do these things, but how to apply them in the business world. And maybe that's where the gap is.
Yeah, there's something about teaching it in context. So I just had the cutest little group of students who they met with their client. They have to run a paid media campaign, but they met with the client and the client was really down on paid media. She's like into influencer stuff and she has an email list of 3,500 people. And I said, oh, well, I'll change the rules of the project. You can run an A/B test if you want, but you'll have to learn how to analyze it. And it'll be slightly different than everybody else's project. You ready? And they signed up for it, and they ran their test. They did the basic analysis that Tim was showing on the left-hand side, and they're like, "Oh, our alternative design, they took the clients against their own design, which was a bad client management strategy, but for students, that's an exciting thing. Like, can we beat the client? And so they did beat the client, but then they computed the confidence interval. And I didn't even show them how to compute the confidence interval until we got to that. And it was non-significant. And I could say, and they're so cute when they summarize it in the thing. They're like, we thought we won, but we didn't really win. And then they had ideas for future tests, but learning that confidence interval thing and what it means in the context of a real problem, what should we tell the client to do next, makes so much more sense to people.
Yeah.
So I think it's about not learning a bag of tricks, but like being in a situation and then having your coach say, oh, do you know this trick? Let me show it to you. That people get it a lot more in context. Hey, Tim, a different subject. I want to take the gray things and put them into two piles. Some of those techniques are about inference. They're about measuring uncertainty, like regression or, and some of those techniques are about finding the right counterfactual. And some of them are a mixture. And that's kind of an important subtlety to know, that some of them are about finding the right counterfactual and some of them are about measuring uncertainty. And some of them are about both. And that, I don't know. I want to sort them.
It's a good way to sort.
Maybe if you put boxes in front of me, I want to sort them.
And time. And Kelly's like, we're out of time.
Yep.
I do want to remind everybody, if you don't know, our next conversation is actually going to be with Dr. Elea Feit, and she's going to share some of the groundbreaking work that she's done that affects our industry. So make sure you sign up to join. This call is recorded, will be loaded on the TLC YouTube channel, shared on the TLC Slack. And thank you all. Thank you, panelists. I feel like there was so much here that we didn't even scratch the surface, and we're going to keep these conversations going on the TLC Slack channel. And if the need exists, we'll have more conversations in the future. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, TLCers. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.